Disclaimer. 1. I don't own Hollow Knight 2. This is just a work of fanfiction, and it is not intended to harm mossbag's reputation in any way. In this work, Grimmchild is an adult, so he's almost at the same stage of development as Grimm was when they first came to Hallownest. The only biological difference between canon Grimm and my version of Grimmchild is that the latter has a bit more time left before he'd have to do the ritual again. I think I mentioned this fact in the work itself, but I'm gonna say it here too, just in case. The reason I chose not to use Troop Master Grimm / Nightmare King Grimm instead is that he already has a set personality that wouldn't fit into the story. Grimmchild, however, is closer to being a blank slate, so that gave me a bit more creative freedom. I only said mossbag x Grimm in the title of this video, because in practice, I want you to picture Grimm whenever I say Grimmchild, because to me, adult Grimmchild would look very similar to his father. Anyways, please don't sue me for libel or defamation or copyright infringement or whatever. You woo. Title: Defeating the author of my immortal in hand-to-hand combat and taking back my throne. Mossbag leaned forward in his chair and kissed Grimmchild on the cheek. Grimmchild's heart was racing. They'd been intimate so many times, and yet every touch, every kiss, still felt electric. Grimmchild squealed ecstatically. Sit, said Mossbag. His tone was playful yet commanding. Grimmchild loved it when Mossbag spoke to him like that. Of course, Grimmchild was always eager to do anything Mossbag asked, but something about that tone of voice had a tremendous amount of power over his state of mind. Grimmchild gracefully dropped to his knees. He was still smiling. This was where he belonged, kneeling at Mossbag's feet. Grimmchild almost wanted to freeze time so he could enjoy this moment forever. Almost, but he knew what Mossbag wanted him to do next, and that excited him even more. Good boy, Mossbag cooed. He rested his hand between the pointy parts of Grimmchild's head. Grimmchild rubbed his face against Mossbag's hand like an affectionate housecat and made a small whimpering noise. Technically, Grimmchild wasn't supposed to speak unless spoken to, but even without speaking, he made his desires obvious. In this case, Mossbag didn't mind. With one fingertip, he tilted Grimmchild's head up slightly, and for a moment they stared into each other's eyes. Grimmchild made another small whimpering noise. This time, it was pitched up at the end, like a question. Would you like to give me a blowjob? Asked Mossbag. Yes, Grimmchild replied, nodding eagerly. Grimmchild unzipped Mossbag's jeans, and Mossbag immediately started pleasuring himself. His cock wasn't completely hard yet, but it would be soon. Grimmchild stared at it in admiration. It was thick, nicely shaped, and 9 inches in length. Of course, that was true last time, and the time before that, and the time before that, but he was still struck by how gorgeous and powerful it looked. Although he was almost at the same stage of development as his father was when they first met that little vessel, Grimmchild was still quite small for one of his kind. Mossbag was much taller and sturdier than he was, and Grimmchild loved it. His waist was thinner than Mossbag's thigh, and, as he observed now, his wrists were thinner than Mossbag's cock. The size difference was just one of the many things about their relationship that made Grimmchild feel delicate and brought out his sexually submissive tendencies. Grimmchild stroked the shaft with his hands, then carefully put the tip in his mouth and started massaging it with his tongue. The Careless Whispers saxophone melody randomly started playing in the background. It was relatively quiet, and at this point, neither Grimmchild nor Mossbag particularly cared to figure out where it was coming from or turn it off. Also, I'm not sure if Grimm or Grimmchild even have tongues, but whatever. Anyways, Grimmchild could feel Mossbag hardening in his mouth. It was an exciting sensation, almost an overwhelming one, but he couldn't afford to lose himself in it. He needed to focus on Mossbag's pleasure. Grimmchild carefully lowered himself until the tip of Mossbag's cock was at the back of his throat, and then started sucking. Mossbag moaned quietly. Grimmchild rhythmically bobbed his head up and down, pleasuring the first 2 inches with his mouth, and using his hands for the rest. He paused, then synchronized the motions of his hands with those of his head. Mossbag thrust his hips forward. His cock went further down Grimmchild's throat, and Grimmchild gagged, overwhelmed with pleasure. Mossbag involuntarily thrust his hips forward again, and Grimmchild gagged even harder. Grimmchild didn't mind that he still had a gag reflex. In fact, he liked it. He liked gagging on Mossbag's cock, only to have it forced further down his throat. It was pleasurable in a masochistic sort of way. Suddenly, Grimmchild tasted something. It was precum. Salty and bitter and musky. He swallowed it and started sucking harder. He knew it was just precum because there wasn't enough of it, and the sensation as a whole wasn't intense enough for mossbag to have climaxed. Grimmchild had done this enough times to know that whenever mossbag climaxed, his cock would move rhythmically, rather than stay still, twitch, or harden as it had for the last few minutes. "Oh, yes," said mossbag softly. Fucking Grimmchild's throat was one of the most pleasurable things he'd ever done. Grimmchild had no teeth, so he wouldn't accidentally bite or scrape him during a blowjob the way his girlfriend would. Not only that, but his throat was much tighter than her pussy. Grimmchild continued bobbing his head. Faster than he had at the beginning. He tasted and immediately swallowed more precum. Because mossbag's cock was so thick, Grimmchild had to open his mouth as wide as he possibly could, so his jaw was getting a bit sore, but he liked that, too. Grimmchild moaned. It was a throaty moan, and mossbag could feel the vibrations on his cock. He grabbed the sides of Grimmchild's head and thrust his hips forward again. This time, he went all the way down Grimmchild's throat. Grimmchild gagged, then involuntarily swallowed, his body's way of keeping him from gagging again. Then mossbag started thrusting his hips more forcefully. His cum filled Grimmchild's mouth and throat. This was it. In a state of pure bliss, Grimmchild continued sucking and bobbed his head in sync with mossbag's thrusts. He could feel mossbag's cock pulsating in his throat, and he loved it. The cum was much more salty and intense than Grimmchild remembered, more than the precum, even, but he eagerly swallowed all of it. For him, most of the pleasure came from pleasing mossbag. After Grimmchild swallowed the first load, there was still more, so he kept sucking and swallowing until mossbag was done. Mossbag took his cock out of Grimmchild's throat, pulled his underwear and pants back up, and readjusted how he was sitting. "Good boy," mossbag told Grimmchild. "Thank you," he replied happily. "Is there anything else I can do?" Mossbag gazed down at Grimmchild, who was still kneeling at his feet. Of course, there were a lot of things Grimmchild could do for mossbag. The dishes needed to be washed, and the laundry needed to be done, but Grimmchild was already getting tired, and didn't quite know his own limits. For whatever reason, all incarnations of Grimm needed to sleep right after any kind of sexual activity. It probably had something to do with their biology, but mossbag didn't want to make a Hollow Knight lore video about it until he had more information. "Please stop the Careless Whisper soundtrack," said mossbag. "It's kind of getting on my nerves. I think it might be coming from the defective iPhone hooked up to the Wafdale speakers in the recording studio on the 3rd floor of the house, but I'm not sure. Other than that, you should get some rest." "Oh, okay," said Grimmchild. Just as Grimmchild was standing up to leave, mossbag added, "And don't make my mistake. You can't just pause it or put the iPhone to sleep. You have to actually turn the damn thing all the way off." Grimmchild nodded, then left. Mossbag had kept that stupid iPhone out of sentimentality, but after it randomly unpaused itself and ruined an otherwise perfect experience, he realized he should probably get rid of it. He swiveled his chair around, opened his laptop, and checked his YouTube page. For some reason, his Ben Shapiro Plays Sonic Adventures 2 video hadn't gotten nearly as many views as most of his Hollow Knight lore videos. This mildly disappointed him. He'd written a literary masterpiece, and its greatness had gone unacknowledged by the masses. At this point, he was almost finished writing Ben Shapiro Plays Sonic Adventures 2 Part 2, and he knew that its viewership would likely be smaller than that of his next Hollow Knight lore video, but he didn't let that discourage him. Just as Grimmchild stopped the Careless Whisper soundtrack and turned off the defective iPhone, mossbag had a brilliant idea. All he had to do was retitle the sequel to his masterpiece, and both works would finally get the recognition they deserved. He pulled up the manuscript for the sequel, and changed a small bit of text, the working video title section. Instead of Ben Shapiro Plays Sonic Adventures 2 Part 2, the title would be We Finally Know Silksong's release date. That's it, that's the end of this fanfiction. If you absolutely fucking hated it, be sure to smash that dislike button, unsubscribe from my channel, and drop a hate comment below.